love that for my things.
Is there a certain picture you want showing?
I'm just gonna leave that one up. Yeah,
Just that one?
yeah, just a fun way to start.
Okay.
Yeah. We're a situation. Oh, right. Yeah, I said it.
This isn't a very big crowd. Are we missing some?
I think a few.
Okay.
It's really busy, like you said. It's really fast.
Ready to go? Delicioso.
Well, you're right.
All right.
I pride myself for being on time.
Here's a couple more. Don't you? Oh, we are 2 on the nose. Do you want this little speaker? Apparently people like it. So it is on. Yeah, if you talk into it, it'll work. I'll try it. It'll talk back. It should.
Oh. Good morning. No, afternoon. It is afternoon. Good day. I'm just gonna go with that for now, and it's just a lot safer, because I don't even know what day it is, but it's gotta be a good one, right? So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this afternoon's presentation. We are utilizing Patrick's time and then some while he's here this week. We had a opportunity to talk about Ollie in front of TV 12 in Good Morning Mid-Michigan. And so the clip should be out soon, but we talk all about Ollie and the travel and the learning experiences. So if you have a second, and maybe you need to watch, I'm not sure, we didn't watch it, but look for our interview, because we always want to try to get the word out about Ollie and all the great things that it has for folks to get involved with, whether it be classes, travel, multiple day travel, all those type of things. So we're trying to spread the word and make sure that people get involved and continue their learning journey. So on that note, we're going to introduce Patrick Twomey. I think just about everyone knows him. We are so fortunate to have him back. And then at the end of this week, if you hadn't heard, we're doing an international tourism program, part of the other side of the house of Center for Adult Learning, the continuing ed part. And so he's going to be teaching students on international tourism, and then they'll receive a certificate at the end of the program, which is a 2-day program. So he comes from us from Banff, and I think he's bringing the weather, because tomorrow or Thursday's
snow.
So maybe that's what he jinxed us with. I'm not sure. My son is a snow removal individual that gets through college by doing that, so he's psyched about Thursday. So bring it on. But nonetheless, we will hand it over to Patrick, and thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. All right. This sort of worked yesterday, so I'll try and use this. Are you hearing me just nice and clear at the back? Okay. Doesn't quite fit my head perfectly, so it flops around a little bit. So, vamos a hablar un poquito de España y Portugal. Obrigado. ¿Quién habla español?
No.
Nadie. Ni una palabra. ¿Y habla portugués? No. Sí, tú hablas español. Bravo. They told me I have to do this one in Spanish. Well, it's lovely to have you here. It's a fascinating part of the world. And we're going to cover, though, because I know we've heard a lot about the tour, so I thought I would take the opportunity to give you some of the bigger picture history and some of the modern life. But it's, the effect that Iberia, so we're talking about the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, of course, that little cube that sits off of Southwest Europe, changed the world. In fact, very specifically, as early as 1494, the Pope split the world between the Kingdom of Castilla, which is Castillon, and Portugal. Can you imagine? They basically put the line at Cape Verde, which are islands off of Africa. The Portuguese were very, very good at tacking upwind. They had triangular sails. And they were the first ones to really start venturing around Africa. And then, of course, you all heard that a guy named Columbus sailed over. Boy, did we get that wrong. Now, in my country, we no longer call Indigenous people Indians. We talk about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And I think that's really important, but generally Indigenous people. So it took 3 trips before Columbus realized that he wasn't in India, but they still called them the West Indies. So within basically a year, they knew they were nowhere near India. And yet 500 years later, people think it's polite to call Indigenous people here Indians. So that's why we moved away from that as term, because there's 1.3 billion people in India. And I think they're Indians. So that's an interesting point. All that noted, they shouldn't have been called the West Indies either, because they were sailing west, so they would have been on the east side. So they should have been the east side. There's a lot wrong. But it's an interesting thing. But I just had to put this picture up because you can't go to that part of the world and not talk about food. Believe it or not, of course, olives are like the economy of southern Spain, and they're very, very good for you. I did not like olives until I was 37 years old. And I specifically remember that because when I was 37 years old, a year or two ago, I did a master's degree in Paris, and my son was living, well, he was 2, and so we could kind of get family sabbatical. But then we went down to southern Spain, and I've lived in South America, so I genuinely speak fluent Spanish, but I wrote my thesis down there, and every table we sit down on, there's always olives. And of course, and I just said, this is stupid. They're healthy, they're everywhere, I have to learn to like them. And I kept eating them every day until now I like olives. So I think you do the same thing with Guinness, by the way. They're little tricks. But those little fish you see are boquerones. And if I can ever find boquerones, which once in a while I can find them at home, I get a little pack and they cost me about $25. They cost next to nothing in Spain. Those are anchovies, but they're not the salty ones. They're preserved in white vinegar. So it's a whole different taste. So that is, of course, one of the great examples of tapas. Right? And tapas, of course, the little share plates. Portuguese food, incidentally, is quite different from Spanish food, and we can talk about both while we go through here. But I just ran a trip in Spain after, and I'm actually back in Spain in April, so I had a few current photos. So I just thought it'd be fun to share a couple, and then we're going to climb into some history. But I want to show you one other thing, and there's a long story in this, because that, and you will notice there's a beer there. That's breakfast. So breakfast in Spain is one of my favorite. I'm not a big breakfast eater. I try desperately to wake up hungry in the morning, but of course you tend to eat quite late at night there. But that is pan con tomate, so bread with tomato. That's the Madrid style. That's where it's pre-made. So it's tomato with olive oil on top. But what you want to do when you go home tonight or tomorrow is get good whole grain bread, right? Your nice thick, good thick whole grain bread. Toast it. And then get the tomatoes, juicy tomatoes you can, cut it in half. And, before the tomato, you get a garlic clove, peel it, cut it in half, and you rub the garlic clove onto the bread, toasted bread. Just literally fresh. Then you get your half tomato and you rub that on the bread. Then you put on olive oil. That is Catalan breakfast. And Catalonia, you probably know, is Barcelona. So that's how you make it there. But in Madrid, they have a pre-made mix. And then always the olive oil. And I'm not kidding, when you see breakfast in better hotels in Spain, you get up in the morning, they have all the cured meats, all the porks, the serrano ham, all the different breads, and then they literally have like champagne and beer. Oh, I was just a few months ago in Croatia, and I stayed in one hotel, which is like the best hotel in Croatia, and I don't tend to drink at breakfast. And I came down and they actually had an oyster bar with champagne, and I'm like, folks, we're leaving later today. Anyway, that's just kind of fun. If you don't eat pork, Spain is a bit tough. And that goes right back, of course, to things like the Spanish Inquisition as well. And we'll get into some of the heavier conversations about that. But that is chorizo, which is, of course, Spanish sausage. Different versions of it everywhere. If you want to make that at home, I cook it and then you cook it in red wine and you let it sit for about a day. Very common thing, and it can be just delicious. But again, all of the pork was another way of finding out if people were Jewish, Sephardic Jews. And so I'd like to, we can come back and talk about these bigger subjects a little bit later on, but I just want to first of all put it in perspective where we're talking about. I like the fact that here in Michigan, we are almost exactly in line with northern Spain. Gives you kind of a sense where we are in the world, right? You obviously get way more winter than they do as a general rule. Reason being, of course, is we're in the middle of a continent out here, and you have the lake effect, and all sorts of reasons. And North America is the colder side of the planet, really, because we have the two colder versions. But let's just zoom in. There we go. That is really Iberia, right there. By the way, these islands down here, you might know them, Tenerife, the Canary Islands, they belong to Spain. That plays the role for Europeans the way the Caribbean does for North Americans, as a weekend getaway in the winter. But Spain and Portugal are a very interesting, really rather arid area that were historically quite poor. Now, we're going to be getting into money in a little bit here, but I just want to give you a little bit of kind of the background on the whole thing. So the Romans arrive into this region in the 2nd century BC. All right. Now remember, just a little bit after that, they get up into Britain and they go all the way up into Hadrian's Wall, which is where their limit was with Scotland. But they come all the way down here, and the Roman Empire is across the north. Previous to that, there were two distinct groups, linguistic groups that we know of living in the area. So one were Celtic peoples. You all know who the Celts are? You guys definitely do, because you came to Ireland. So Ireland, Wales, Scotland, those are the Celtic languages. We are pretty sure, genetically, the Irish came up through what is now Portugal, Galicia, up top there, and all the way up to Ireland. That's probably what migration is. But what's the other linguistic group that you find in Spain? It's probably the oldest language spoken in Europe. Anyone have a guess? If I said Etrusc, that might mean something, but then if I say Basque, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So the Basque language is up at Bilbao. So I'm going to get my pointer out. I meant to dig that out. So the Basque language, from all guesses, and this is not me, this is linguists telling us this, may well be the language that was spoken in Europe prior to the arrival of the Celts. All right, and so the last bit of Basque that's still spoken is up from Bilbao and across the border in France. And there was quite a violent separatist movement there for a while, but that's because, of course, under Spain was under a dictatorship with Franco for decades, and he tried to make their language illegal. Really good way to upset, right? Hey. So you've got that section. Just to piece apart Iberia, though. So obviously Portugal's one country, Spain. Do you see Andorra? You see that word up there? Has anyone been there? That is one of the smallest countries in the world. That is an independent country. It's the only country whose official language is Catalan. And Catalan is spoken up in Barcelona. So interesting, tiny country. Every year, Andorra's still at war with Germany, by the way. They never signed a peace treaty after World War II. And Andorra, every year, to maintain its independence, they pay a tithe to the head of the Catholic Church in Spain, and they pay a tithe to the President of France. And their whole economy is duty-free. All that kind of ended with the European Union. They ski up in there. So those are the Pyrenees Mountains. So that boundary is a really significant one. The Pyrenees go right across. So the border between France and Spain is a pretty natural border. But so you had Celtic tribes living up through here. We've got cave paintings and stuff in the Basque area going back 40,000 years. So this is some of the oldest, certainly in Europe, the longest group of people living in an area. The Romans arrive in the 2nd century before Christ. They move in here, and that's what brings in the Latin language, or we call it Vulgar Latin. And that's why outside of Italy, you have all these languages that are the Romance languages. And we can all name them. So Italian, self-evident. Latin is still kind of spoken up in Graubünden, which is where St. Moritz is. That's the southeast area of Switzerland. Romanish, they call it. There's 5 valleys that speak a very old dialect. Then you have Romanian over on the other side. and then Spanish, Portuguese, and we almost say dialects. Galicia, which is the area of Spain that's above Portugal, that's actually the older form of the Portuguese language. But the reason Portuguese went a different route from Spanish is in 711. It's a good 711 comes from Osaka, Japan. It's different 711. Who arrives here in Iberia?
Moors.
The Moors, exactly right. The Arabs, right? The Moors come up and they invade more Spain with their big capital in Granada, right? But up in the north here, Portuguese starts to form as its own language, and there's less Moorish or Arabic influence. And so really, there's a lot more French influence into the Portuguese language, whereas the Spanish language has a huge number of Arabic words. Really, Spanish is not Italian because of that element. Do you know how to say left in Spanish? Izquierda. All those words, the I, it's I-Z, I-Z, that's all Arabic. And one of the fun expressions that you learn in the Spanish language when you learn to speak Spanish is we have this expression to say, I hope. You know, we say it right now. The Chiefs gonna win, I hope, you know? Well, the Spanish version of saying that is ojalá. Ojalá, but it's not a conjugated word like other elements of Spanish. Ojalá is Allah. Allah Akbar, God is great. Came straight from Arabic language. So you just see that show up so much in Spanish in Spain. And then again, up in the Barcelona area, which is the most industrial part of Spain and the wealthiest area, they speak Catalan all the way over to Perpignan in France. And Catalan Occitan is really a mix between Spanish and French. So again, I speak French at home with my son, and I speak Spanish. So when I'm in Barcelona, I can't speak it particularly well because the accent's so different, but I can read it because perfectly, you know. So they're all kind of dialectic differences. So that's just kind of an introduction. And then what year do the Spanish liberate themselves from the Moors? Really, really significant year in American history. 1492. So it was literally as they eventually defeat them in Granada, they push the Moors out. Remember, the Moors had beautiful math, beautiful gardens, beautiful art, like it really is there infused. But with that, it was that energy of pushing the Moors out and fighting this continuous war that was the same energy that had the Queen of Spain pay Columbus to take his journey west. It was that same sort of almost evangelical movement. And it was the same thing that leads, of course, to the Inquisition. Very, very tough place to be Jewish in the 15th and 16th centuries up there. And there was a huge Jewish population, particularly up in Toledo. And there's effectively none anymore. So that's just another story. By the way, whenever you see these AL worlds, Albacete, the AL is always an Arabic name too. So that comes linguistically. But so that's kind of the process. Now, if we're getting up to the 1400s, both of these little kingdoms are pretty poor. And they're pretty poor, and you'll see that when you go see the middle of the country, to see how dry it looks. A lot of Spain is a big central plateau, not particularly productive. That's that whole bull tradition they have and raising pigs, because they had to really herd a lot more rather than farm, and of course fishing along the coast. So it was dry, but it was one of the poor kingdoms in Europe. By 1600, it's the richest place on planet Earth, hands down, and that's because, of course, these continents over here. So if you allow me to bounce around a little bit, I want to talk about the modern sense and the modern wealth that became Iberia and the role it played in the world, very genuinely, for better and for worse, because it was also the origin of crimes against humanity. But I am going to, some of you might have seen this video. This coin, no one leaves the room until I get 20 minutes. This coin, this one's 1508, or sorry, 1808. Or 1809. But I bought this myself in La Paz, Bolivia. I have two. I have one that doesn't have a hole in it. But when you have the hole, it's because they used to wear their money. This is pure silver. But on it, I'm going to pass it around. On it is the same symbol you see on the Spanish flag today. So I want to give you this history, but let's start passing around. It's so interesting. And there's something you want to look for on it. But I'm going to show you. It's very hard to point it out on that, but I do have a picture, which just makes a little bit more sense when I show it to you. Right There. Now, this is an article that I wrote a number of years ago. The most important city of the last 500 years. And unless you've been on a trip with me, I reckon most of you have never heard of Potosi, Bolivia. And I'm just sure you haven't heard of it. You might have heard there's a Potosi in Mexico, there's one in Nicaragua, but Potosi, Bolivia. So and this is a lecture unto itself, but making a long story short, the Spanish, of course, show up in Cuba and Hispaniola in 1492, right? By 1534, they're walking through the Andes. So they've come across Panama. Of course, the canal's not built for another 500 years, but they come across Panama, they go down to what is now Peru, and they go up into the mountains. And they come the other way up from where Buenos Aires is now. And it's called the Plata River, the River Plate, and that means silver in Spanish. They were going to find El Dorado. They wanted to find the city of gold. And the fact is, they found it, but it wasn't gold, it was silver. And they find Potosi, which is actually a mispronunciation of a Quechua word. Quechua is the Inca language, Potosi. They find this thing, well, they find it, the Incas know it was there, but sticking out the top of it was 100 feet of pure silver. It was the biggest silver reserve on planet Earth. By 1600, the city of Potosi was 4 times the size of Madrid, the same size of London, the first multi-ethnic city in the world. It gets worse now. Ready for this? The birth of chattel slavery. And when they started purchasing people, which is we get into some Portuguese history, and shipping them from Africa to go work there, 15% attrition just on the boats. They march them up the hill and they all die from altitude. But the money that comes out of it, and this is you see this art all over Spain. That's the Virgin Mary, of course. Remember, it's very Catholic evangelical, but look at the shape. It's the mountain. And they're saying that it was given to them to evangelize the people. So this is so built in to its history. But the thing I wanted to show you down on that coin as it passes around, and you can try and find it as you look at it, right there is the very first dollar symbol. That's why you have a dollar symbol here in the United States of America. This was effectively the legal currency even here until they started making dollars in the central bank of the United States, because those were the pure silver. And by the mid 1600s, already they were having crises in banks in Europe because they were diluting the silver and it wasn't worth the same thing. But that wealth that was taken out of what is now Bolivia, it was all the Viceroyalty of Peru. So there were 2 viceroyalties, Lima, Peru, and Mexico City, right? All that wealth is brought out, and it ties so much into the modern country now. I just want to, anyway, I can give you a link at some point for this article. There's the mountain. They're still mining there today, by the way. And there's asbestos, and you're at 14,000 feet, and you last about 10 years before you get silicosis in your lungs. So I don't recommend taking a job up there. And that is a devil statue, by the way. Devil lives underground. But look at the miners, they're super militant. Anyway, it's an amazing place. I've been in the mines a few times, but obviously not working. So the reason I mention a lot of that is they get that wealth, but they're up in the middle of nowhere. So that's why Lima is now a city of 10 million people. Like it's the same, it's like Los Angeles. There shouldn't be a city there. Like it's desert, there's no water. You think LA, greater LA, but San Diego, 17 million people. Now they just did have rain, but I mean, they don't have rain. Lima's the same thing. It's that same climatic zone. Well, they ship it out of Lima. They go up and around to Panama, where they would do El Camino de las Cruces, the walk of crosses, because so many people died from yellow fever and malaria going across Panama, to a tiny little place called Portobello, and then they'd ship it over to Havana, Cuba, and then over to Spain in these great big convoys. So what was the French and British response to that? Buccaneers, legalizing piracy. Henry Morgan, all these people, and there's the remnants of a town in Jamaica, and I really want to go there sometime, Port Royal. And that was the true, like when you watch the Pirates of the Caribbean, all that, it's based on that place. It was a true pirate town. And apparently it was all bars and all brothels, and then it was destroyed by an earthquake. And that kind of vitiated a lot of the old Catholic thinking, they were being condemned. But then Lisbon also had one, and half the population died there, and the royal family didn't let them leave. And that played into a lot of Voltaire's writings, because this was really the most Catholic capital in Europe, and that would be the second. But just coming back to this money, so all that silver, as it came across the water and it'd be chased by these pirates. And the pirates had to fight or pay taxes to either Britain or France, because they were going after this incredible wealth. They would come right up to Cadiz. The longest river that's all in Spain, sail comes down through Seville to Cadiz. Henry Morgan burns Cadiz to the ground. And so that's why the boats carried on up to Seville. And that's why Seville itself has such an incredibly impressive cathedral. The most impressive is the Toledo one. But it's so over the top, it's almost not even impressive. Like the amount of gold in the altar is just like you could fix hunger with it, right? But that's why Seville became so significant. Cordoba, again, these important cities, Cordoba and Granada, these were huge Moorish centers. And then one other thing, so we've talked about Andorra, we mentioned the Basque people, we have Portugal. There's one other country on this peninsula. What's the other country? No, Morocco's not, because Morocco's right across here. Andorra's up there. Great Britain. Gibraltar. Right? The Rock of Gibraltar. I think I have a photo. I don't think your tour is going there. I've been there a few times for better and for worse. And I say for better and for worse because it's a weird place. There you go. That is literally the Rock of Gibraltar, right? And this is the runway. And when planes land, they have to close the road. But Britain's hung on to that forever. And that whole thing's like a giant Swiss cheese. When you stand at the top of that, you can see Africa without even using binoculars or anything, right? That's the Great Gates. One of, in old Greek writing, a suggestion maybe of the gates of Hercules and so forth. But basically it's offshore banking. Gibraltar's become less easy than it used to because the United Kingdom has left the European Union. So now you do passport control in and out. So it's just a peculiar little thing, but that was, of course, that continuous ongoing war between Britain and Spain, kind of forever. Oops, sorry, I must have had Firefox. So can you name the only country in Western Europe that never went to war with England?
Germany.
No, Germany got lost. Portugal. And that is part of the origin of port wine. So we've talked a bit about food. So obviously you have Lisbon down there. Look how little population's in the middle of Portugal, right? So basically everyone's up the coast here. Lisbon is a gorgeous city, by the way. But up there is Porto. And that's the Douro River that comes down. And it's a very strong, heavy wine because it's hot there. And until very recent times, they just sailed it down in barges. But Britain had a 100-year war with France, and they were often at war with Spain. So the Portuguese would sell wine to England. Now, they used to have a lot of wine production in Britain until the mini ice age in the 13th century. And there's really very little wine going that far north anymore. So Porto became this great center of wine, but the wine would often go off. And so if the wine was going off, what they did is they fortified it. So that's why port or sherry is a little bit stronger than regular wine, at 17–18%. So that theoretically you have a corked bottle of port, and it'll never change flavor for the whole time. So that's the origin of port down through there. So we're talking about the Spanish. I see there's a video going on behind me. I don't mean to. I mean, it's nice. I love this university. Let me do. There we go. So Spain becomes so incredibly wealthy with all this wealth that comes up, mostly into Seville, makes its way up to Toledo. Interestingly enough, outside of Madrid is a place. Let me see if I can scan in a little bit more. I want to show you one more. There we go. Anyway, it's Segovia, right there. That little place. Very, very moving place to go to. First of all, there's a Roman aqueduct, so it's already a cool thing to see. But when you drive from Madrid, you go up over mountains. Madrid's quite high up, so 4,000 feet. It's a nice big plateau, lovely climate. But you drive up into the trees. That's where Frank was buried. So remember, we can get into more modern history. He was a dictator right up to the 70s. I mean, the Spanish Civil War, if you're into Hemingway, for example. But he's buried in a dome called El Escorial, and the dome underground is the second largest dome in Christianity. But it's built into the mountain, it's very weird. It's a tomb thing, but you get to Segovia, and it's just a really attractive community anyway, and it has, I didn't go there on my last trip, but I'm actually going on this next one. It has its aqueduct, but that's actually where the royal family was living about the time they started extracting the wealth from the Americas. And why I find it moving to go there is very, very attractive medieval town. They built a lot of the towns historically higher up in points, like you see in Italy, because it's easy to defend. Walled, little castle, and you think of all that incredible wealth, and something like 80% of indigenous people in these continents dying, and you go back and you just see this one little castle. Like, it's remarkably not remarkable, in its own way. So it's just a lot to reflect upon. But Madrid is a very logical capital. But Portugal. So the Portuguese, like I was saying earlier, were fantastic at sailing. What they were not fantastic at was having an economy. And one could argue that today it's still one of the poorer countries in Europe. By the way, very safe, very friendly, very affordable too. Distinctly. We'll talk about Portuguese food in a minute, but out of Lisbon, they were really, since the previous Viking times and so forth, they were the ones who started sailing all the way down around the coast of Africa, and that's where so many of these places that sound so isolated today, like Saint Helena, the island, that's where Napoleon ended up. They were the places that they would restock on their way. And then eventually Magellan was the one who sailed all the way down, was the first person to go around the bottom of South America and actually saw the two oceans meeting. I don't know if anyone's taken a cruise around the bottom of South America. I've been down in Tierra del Fuego numerous times, but I've never cruised around the bottom. I'd love to see that line. Sometime in my life, I want to see, because you literally see the two oceans, right? I mean, it's an amazing thing. I'd say the Portuguese were incredibly effective at tacking up and down wind, and they basically began to control trade with Africa. But the Portuguese ended up all over. You may or may not know this. It is the third most spoken European language, probably the fifth most spoken language on earth. So Spain's about, we're going to round it off to 40 million people, right? About 39. Portugal is about 10 million, the whole country of Portugal. How many people speak Portuguese in your opinion?
Well, there's Brazil.
There's Brazil. Brazil alone is 220 million people. Now, interestingly, so I genuinely speak fluent Spanish. My Portuguese is very poor. In Brazil, I can speak to everyone. In Portugal, I understand virtually nothing. Like, the accents are so different. Can you just give me a few other places that speak Portuguese? See if we just, a few other interesting countries. So Cape Verde, which is down the coast of Africa, that was the line. Everything east of that, when the Pope gave the whole world to these two kingdoms, everything east of that was Portuguese, everything west of that was Spanish. They then moved the line in 1527, I think. Saragossa was the treaty. They moved a little bit more, which more or less gave them Brazil. That's why you've got that one, right? The Portuguese in Brazil weren't going after silver, or they were, but they weren't finding silver and gold. Their gold in Brazil was rubber, by the way, right? That was the wealth extracted mostly from Brazil. Brazil's another big story. So keep going down. Mozambique was Portuguese. Guinea-Bissau was Portuguese. The Portuguese were, well, it is considered to be the longest colonial empire in modern human history, starting in the late 1400s with some of these ports, and not ending until, you guys I think know your history. What year do you think? 1975. That's when they get rid of the dictatorship here, and that's when countries like Angola become independent. Angola's one of the wealthier African countries because there's diamonds there, but that's where you see a lot of the beer sands and things like that. The Portuguese go all the way around. They had a famous port in India. I don't remember his name. It's just off the top of my tongue. I've been there, but that was Portuguese one. I remember backpacking there in India one time. The Indian trains don't go there because the British wouldn't go the train to the Portuguese settlement. And I met this lovely gentleman, sat on a ride on a bus with him for about 4 hours, and he said, "Oh, our memory is not good of them." And then they ended up in East Timor. Remember when East Timor became independent from Indonesia? That was Portuguese. It's actually more Hindu there rather than Catholic. But East Timor was one of the best freshwater ports. The Portuguese ended up trading in Japan, and that's really around Kobe. It was the one place that you could get a permit to trade. And what other place in China? Can you think of it? I like to mention it because it's a weird place. It's called Macau. So Macau, you can take a 1-hour ferry from Hong Kong. It's much smaller than Hong Kong. And the first time I ever went to Macau, I had read all this Portuguese history. What I hadn't read or hadn't absorbed is it's the most densely populated place on planet Earth now. So you've got one historic square, and the rest are buildings and casinos. Because they were legal, but that one switched over a few years before Hong Kong switched over to China. But that's how vast the Portuguese Empire was. But Portugal internally never became industrialized. And so Portugal was one of these really peculiar former kingdoms in Europe, where the royal family picked up and moved to Brazil. And they picked up and moved to Brazil all the way to Brazilian independence. So, an interesting time. So we'll come back to that. Hold that in space for a minute. The French, under Napoleon, invade Iberia, but mostly Spain, in the early 1800s. So already Spain was this massive, powerful economic bloc, and it had very little relationship with the rest of Europe, except it kept going to war with England. And that's why you have people with Spanish blood in the west of Ireland, because the Spanish Armada kept floating up the remnants, and then they'd hang them in Galway. Yeah, that was fun to be a mariner in those days. So Napoleon comes in, invading Spain. That's what really keys off the independence movements in the Americas and their colonies. And that's why if you were in the late 1700s, you wouldn't call yourself a Latin American. You would have called yourself an Ibero-American if you were in Argentina or Mexico or any one of these countries. Well, the French come up with this term, Latin America, to try and say, oh no, we're still all Latins. And all the criollos, the native-born elite, colonial elites, all the way from Mexico down to Argentina, are like, nope, we want out. And so starting in 1809 with Simon Bolivar, basically from 1809 to 1821, they all declared independence. And the Spanish did fight, but they just didn't have the power because they were busy fighting at home as well. And that's why Latin America almost entirely becomes independent, with a couple of exceptions. Dominican Republic and Cuba. Cuba doesn't break away until the Spanish-American War, right? Which is 1890, I think, 1887, something like that. And what was the other big colony that the Spanish had that wasn't in Latin America? Can you remember another huge country? And a big role once again with the United States.
Philippines.
Exactly, Philippines. Yeah, Philippines down the other side. And that was one of those interesting, when you read the point at which the Philippines become its independence, it was actually American core opposition to the idea of colonialism, right? An actual respect for getting independence. So, interesting point there. But so by 1823, we'll call it, Spain's source of wealth has just dissipated. The Spanish royal family, all through the 300 years of, honestly, crimes against humanity over in this side of the continent, this side of the world, the royal family got 20% of everything. It's called a royal fifth. But they just didn't understand inflation. Spain always struggled with that. It's good to use the euro now, I think. But they changed the whole world economy with that influx of wealth, wherever that coin's going around. Literally changed the whole world economy. And they lost so much that wealth that you can track the French, British, and Dutch empires to Spain not managing that wealth well. And this is another thing people sometimes forget, maybe not, that Spain, through a series of marriages, basically Europe was the Habsburgs, France, and Britain. And through marriages, Spain ends up owning the Netherlands, which included Belgium. And then they break away and become independent, mostly because, of course, the Netherlands becomes Protestant, and very Calvinist. And then Belgium breaks away from them because they're still Catholic, but they still wanted to trade. Right? But Spain's real colonial story dies 1823, you could argue up to 1890 with Cuba, and Cuba was incredibly wealthy. I've asked this before in other talks, but in 1750, what was the wealthiest island on planet Earth? Haiti. Yeah. And that was the French Empire, that was sugar cane. So much so, 92% of the population of Haiti was enslaved people. And not generationally enslaved, because they all died during harvest. So they bring more boats over. Like I said, when you climb into that history, it's always worse than you think, it's always heavier. But so Cuba was another huge sugarcane producer, of course. But basically, Spain has a much longer period than other major Western European countries outside its colonial source of income. And internally, it is only in recent decades that Spain has become a liberal country. And what I mean by liberal is church attendance went from like 99%. It wasn't really till after Franco that it drops down to, fairly equivalent numbers with Western Europe, somewhere in that realm. And it's not a judgment on one's beliefs, but that it was very frozen in its time, as was Portugal. I mean, these were heavily Catholic dictatorships. And in fact, when we talk about dictatorships, when we come back to Portugal, when all of Africa starts rising up and getting independence, Portugal wasn't going to bring in new democratic governments to those countries because they didn't have one at home, right? Whereas France and Britain kind of pretended they were going to help them along, So Spain has this kind of 100 years through the 1900s into the early 20th century of a pretty flat economy, right? You would have had people migrating out, and this is where you suddenly see the boom in economies like Argentina. Argentina is unfortunately a vast, beautiful country, like go. It's a basket case right now as an economy, but it was the second richest country in the world around World War I. And that's because of refrigeration, because they produced beef. And as soon as you got refrigerated boats, they could ship meat out. That was their source of wealth. But so you'd have tons of migration out of Spain. We came around in, my father was an Irishman, they immigrated. Same thing, Ireland, you had the average 10 kids in a house or something. Well, 9 of them had to go because there wasn't enough work. And that was so true of Spain and Portugal. So they had this colonial history to move out to, but there's just nothing too vibrant going on there. So that's just it. And we will come to the more modern time. But let's climb on over back to Portugal, because Portugal just kind of stayed outside the European argument, had this good relationship with Britain particularly, which you move into the 20th century, the British Empire was just getting bigger and more powerful. Now, they lost you guys in 1776. Congratulations, by the way. Do you know that I thought it was on this day? The land under my house, I have a contract with Queen Elizabeth II. I know. Well, now that's because I live in a national park. So it's government land. We call it Crown land in Canada. So even though I have obviously a Canadian passport, the head of state, my whole life is Queen Elizabeth II. It's now King Charles III. And I'm not sending him the money for my land until he comes and gets it. Not really, which is but that's so but that's that British thing. So even though the US steps away, and the US, as we all know, wasn't really industrialized until later in the 1800s, and then becomes a powerhouse really around World War I. Well, even World War I doesn't have a great deal to do with this part of the world. It's still pretty isolated. World War I is more about the fact that Germany got together so late and was trying to burst out of its seams because it was trapped. It wasn't part of any of these economic unions. It didn't have much in the way of colonies. They did have a couple of little ones. That led to that horrific war. So that changes that story a little bit. But Portugal, the royal family take off in the 1800s over to Brazil because Brazil was nice. Right? They had a carnival and life was pretty easy for the elite over there because what did they not do in Brazil? Liberate the enslaved people. So now there is some enslavement still in some parts of the world, so it's important to acknowledge that. But the second last place to end chattel slavery, that's what we call it, where people are shipped over and sold in markets. Second last place to get rid of it was Cuba, right? And then it's late 1880s that Brazil ends slavery. I have a friend, incidentally, that I'm sure I could get her to come. She'd have to do virtually a talk for you. She lives in Salvador de Bahia, which is in Brazil, out coast, beautiful place. She is Afro-Japanese Brazilian, but she just talks about the emancipation. And she's got the picture she shows of when they finally ended enslavement. And the painting of it was a whole group of elite Portuguese white dudes. So that's what's going on there. And eventually, the people back in Lisbon, the elite, say to the royal family, hold on, you're Portuguese, you're not Brazilian, come home. So basically, king moves back to Portugal, son stays in Brazil and declares independence. And that's where you start to see the decline of that wealth. Well, Brazil is incredibly disequal in terms of wealth, but it's a very wealthy country, right? I mean, the amount of resources that thing has. So, that's another story for another day. So Portugal then stays out here, but keeps trading, of course, in Macau, still keeps trading all over Europe. But then by the rise of the 1930s, both countries get caught up in something that starts in Italy, El Movimiento de Fascismo, the fascist movement, of course, and that's Mussolini, you remember? So he's the first one. We can always argue other historical markers, but he's the first one of the big names to come to power. He comes to power over in Italy. Then you might remember a really offensive creature in Germany started to come to power. That was aligned with the rise of dictatorial powers in these two countries. And one can argue that World War II actually begins in 1936. One can argue 1933, which is the Manchurian incident, when Japan invades Manchuria, poisons all the water on people, kills. But in 1936, Spanish Civil War erupts. And as all Americans know, Civil War is really the worst kind of war in so many ways, right? So they have essentially two groups. You have the conservatives based in around Madrid, and the others, and the Republicans, we'll call them, in around Barcelona. Now, when you use the word Republican, I think it's always important just to talk with my American friends. In most of the world, when you use Republican, it means you want a republic, not a monarchy. Right? So that's what I say in that macro sense. Like, even though I never support violence, I am an Irish Republican. I believe in United Ireland, to be the Republic of Ireland, right? So that's that term. I would even be a Republican Canadian. I'd rather not have the royal family, but I'm also not going to fight about it. But so you have this division, and that becomes the Spanish Civil War. Now, a couple things happen. So under General Franco are the powers behind the monarchy. It's kind of the traditional conservative Catholic royal family, and then on the other side, you have a whole series of groups that believe in a Republic of Spain, a modernized republic. So many of the ideas that you're getting in the 19th century in France, they have trouble working together because some of them are genuinely communists, some are sort of moderates, and a lot of them are anarchists. If you've ever read some of this history, there was actually an anarchist government in Barcelona. Anarchism is not something, we always just think of it as like no government, but there's actually a whole political philosophy behind anarchism. What I will tell you, just as a reflection, anarchists where everybody gets a vote don't tend to respond very well in a battle to a bunch of fascists who are told where to go. I shouldn't laugh at it because it was an awful war, but Franco invites his buddy in from Germany. And this is the first time Hitler tries the Blitzkrieg. That's where they fly in and carpet bomb cities. This is what then they attack Poland. So that's what happens in Spain. So Spanish government under Franco, which stayed in power until the 1970s, was actually an ally of Nazi Germany. And that's, I think, part of the reason Andorra kind of signed a peace treaty. So, that's some pretty heavy history. Now, I've been traveling to Spain for years, but I'm not old enough to remember those times. My mom backpacked around Europe for a couple of years in the early 60s and went down to Madrid and actually went to a bullfight. My mom's a real animal lover, she shouldn't have gone to a bullfight. But she went to a bullfight and Franco was there. And it was an incredibly conservative, very very Catholic society through that whole period. And the Franco government, and there are still people who miss those days in Spain. So I mean, this, makes Spanish the official language of the whole thing. Well, Spain is a super diverse country, right? You have a whole dialect up in Galicia, you have the Basque language, you have Catalan, you can even argue some other dialects here. And a couple of things that I haven't mentioned yet, but it's sort of interesting. Ceuta and Melilla are two tiny Spanish outports still in Africa. And there's walls, like walls to keep the Africans out. So, you know, it's an interesting thing. So they have this one very strict central government that is controlling the whole of Spain until the 70s. And then the good news is that when Franco was coming towards the end of his life, they reintroduced the monarchy at that point, and the monarchy backed democratic elections. So fortunately in the 70s, Spain did not have another war, and that's modern Spain. Like modern Spain, as you see today when you travel there, and Spain is a lovely country to travel to, but modern Spain really starts to modernize in about 1975. Now that story I just said, I can pretty much say the same thing about Salazar and Portugal. It was less violent within Portugal, they didn't have as big a civil war, but they take over again back in the 30s, you have the dictatorship, but they basically spend the next 5 decades just extracting wealth from their colonial empire, right? And it is still amazing. Portugal has, well, actually all of Western Europe now has fabulous infrastructure. I say Western Europe. Just a few months ago, I told you I did a tour in Croatia. I hadn't been back in about 10 years. The infrastructure is incredible. And that's European Union money. It's like Switzerland. I mean, it's all tunnels, and because you know the coastline is so in-depth. It would have taken 3 days driving, you do about 5 hours now. I mean, it's just incredible. And the infrastructure out here is amazing. So how do you try? Technically, does anyone need a little break? Does anyone need to go to the restroom or stretch your legs? Yeah. Why don't we take just a quick 5-minute break, everyone? And just have a stretch and we'll carry on. We're done.
Hi, how are you doing?
How are you?
Not bad.
Thank you. This is an amazing thing to see though.
Didn't want you to worry.
Thank you very much. Sure, let me get my.
I got goosebumps when I said that.
Yeah, let me get my glasses. Where it is. So basically, it was a trademark. That's what the dollar sign. Some people say it comes from the 2 spikes, but actually it was the trademark, the actual mine. So basically, it's the word right under your thumb. Yeah. It's right on the corner, right there, right where my finger is.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So every
That's so cool.
Spanish silver coin you get from all the mines all over the world would have a trademark for where they're from. So the Mexican ones have an M with a circle over it. But that is actually Potosi. It's the PTS stamped one on top of each other.
Oh.
Yeah. So that becomes the origin of it. Because
Huh.
it's not just us that
That's
use
neat.
it, right? Like pesos use the dollar sign.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you actually see it all over.
Huh.
Yeah. Fascinating bit of history.
And you said something about pork, so I have some hope because I don't like seafood. I
Oh.
don't like beans and rice. I'm like, I don't want to.
Beans and rice you're not really gonna see. Nope. It's the food, I don't love it all, but I struggle more with Portuguese food than I do Spanish food, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but I just find it really salty, but if you don't do seafood at all, then you're always gonna see Serrano ham and all of that,
Okay.
all the time. And sandwiches, the bread is great. And loads of nice little bread sandwiches with, again, the thin cured meat in it.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm good with that, but it's
Yeah.
just like, my son went, years ago through high school, he did an EF tour to Spain and Italy. And he
Yeah.
came home and he's like, Spain, they got nothing but beans and rice, but I'm like, I hope that was like the student.
I think that was just being super cheap, yeah, because the food's pretty good.
Exactly.
A lot of chicken as well, so that's always on a menu. And you can do, I mean, when you're eating on your own, so many places just get a tapas plate to share the different cold cuts, basically,
Right.
and then ice cured meat. It's good. I just find after about a week in Spain, I drink too much because it's cheap and it's good, and and yet when you have tapas, you buy the glass of wine and then they give you something to eat with it.
Oh,
Right?
really?
Yeah, and then you go to another bar. So and particularly in Madrid, it's fun to do. But before you know it, you might have had 5 glasses of wine, right? And you've only actually had a couple of little nibblers on it.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, 'cause we're kind of drawn between the Italy and the Portuguese. Portugal, Spain, and
Yeah,
you know, he kind of, when he was talking about Italy, because I'm like, well, I want to go to Rome. And I'm like, you know, it's a tourist trap. It's going to be so busy and I can go back to Italy. But, you know, the southern just looked really neat.
yeah, it's a pretty small area. Like you've got to be really into the food to get a lot of that tour, I think. That would be my feeling looking at it.
Right.
Yeah. So that was good.
Well, and everyone seemed to be really into the wine. It was
Wine,
the food
yeah.
and drink. And I'm
Yeah.
like, you know,
We're not
I
big
could
wine
not big
drinkers. No.
drinkers. I mean, I'll drink it, but it's not like,
That's not the
These are
event
them
yet. Yeah,
going.
if you really know your wines, Northern Italy has some of the best in the world, but value for money on wine in Spain is fantastic. And Portugal. I
but it
haven't been,
wasn't just food and wine, because when they, you know, talked about it, it's like,
Mm.
okay, I'm gonna get to see some cultures, some historic things.
Yeah.
You know, it looked good. So.
the tour they're offering here, I think is a little more complete tour. Like the fact you get both Lisbon and Madrid and
Right.
Barcelona. Yeah, so
Right.
I think there's maybe like in terms of actual sightseeing, you're getting a bit more of
Yeah,
this
I
one.
mean, it was-
The other one is really
it's
a food oriented.
Yeah, it was like 13 days for this one. I'm like,
Yeah, I
I
was
see a
looking-
lot.
So like I say, next month, April, I guess month after, I'm running a private tour to Spain that I set up. And I'm going into Madrid. So what I'm doing on my one is Madrid for several days, and then I'm going down to Seville and Gibraltar for a day, and then we're going over to Morocco for a day, and then along the coast for a few days. So it's a 11-day trip, but yeah. And it's, I mean, 16 people, because a lot of my groups just capped that way. And it was a group of 10 that approached me, so, yeah. So
Well, it seems like in Barcelona, the people seem very nice, because when I was working, one person lived in Barcelona and I didn't know her that well. And she's like, you have to come visit us. You have to go to Barcelona. Because I told her we went to Ireland, and she's like,
Yeah.
when are you going to come to
Yeah.
Spain and Barcelona? And she's like, you can stay with us. You get
that's nice.
God.
Yeah,
She
it's so
loved her
fun.
country. She
Just-
loved
They
Barcelona.
do. Oh, Catalans but they're Catalan first. I actually have a book at home. I have a friend who lives just outside Barcelona at sort of a blue collar town called Villanova. We met hitchhiking in Ireland when we were 19 and we're still friends. And he's a journalist. And so he's written about tourism stuff.
Right.
And so I just saw him last year when I was there. And yeah, he writes in Catalan, not in Spanish. And yeah, I've stayed with him. We spent Christmas there the year I was there with my son. And it's
Right.
lovely.
Spain's never been on my bucket list, but it seems like the places that you don't really have high expectations. turn out to
Often,
like
yeah.
the most, and you know.
Do you know one of my favorite countries in Europe though, is for kind of dipping your toe into Europe, is actually Switzerland. Because the infrastructure is fantastic. It's breathtakingly beautiful, but every canton, there's 32 of them, or 26. Everyone's different. Like in tiny little areas, you know, a different dialect, different language, different architecture. And of course, everything works and everything's clean. So I always think that's a really neat,
Switzerland is on
Yeah,
my bucket list,
yeah.
so.
it's a neat country to start with.
I was in Madrid in 63 and 64,
Yeah, yeah.
and I was at the Terre Haute Air Force Base.
Is that right?
Yeah, and we'd gone to town,
Uh-huh.
and Franco was still in charge.
Yeah.
And they said, you know, the police that have the hats that are pushed up,
Mm-hmm.
said, if they tell you to do something, you better do it, or they'll shoot you.
Yep,
And that's it.
it was real fascist police back then.
Yeah.
Yep.
I
It's
said,
like,
holy fuck.
yeah, yes, sir.
But I rented a cab to go all around Spain Madrid, and it was like $4 a day.
Oh, back then. And actually, I'm glad you reminded
And
me,
I went to
taxis
all
are
the-
still cheap in Spain
I said, I want to see all the,
comparatively to everything
I
else.
want to see all the fountains and all the.
Yeah.
statues. Okay, let's go. It was something, so. anyhow,
Oh, that's a neat story.
I know that I read in a book, because I read a lot of history.
Good, yeah.
In between Spain and France, or isn't there a lot of big, I don't remember, it was silver mine or copper mine or something that they were supplying the rest of Europe?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's quite a lot of mining. They were mining up in the Basque Country, and there's a lot of coal up there too. Like, so historically coal mining up where Bilbao is and San Sebastian, which I think is on the map too. Yeah, it is. Yeah, so that's all mining up through there. Yeah. Oh, you're right. No, you're right by the border there, actually. Yeah, no, if I'll just right where I'm just, that's San Sebastian right there.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's right on the French border. Yeah. Yeah. Tons of mining, and then the Pyrenees are fantastic. It's full of old monasteries. Like, they're just really beautiful, and they actually are protecting things enough that some of the wildlife is coming back. So that's neat. Yeah. Wildlife is coming back. I think bears are back now in the Pyrenees and they weren't to start. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you showed it where it was. I didn't have a map when I was reading it.
Yeah, Navarra as well, all right where the border is. That's the border's super natural border, and so you've got lots of mines either side. Yeah. That's
Seemed like it was going back and forth between countries.
absolutely, yeah. How are we doing, everyone? Shall we carry on? And I know there's lots of neat conversation because it's such a fascinating part of the world. What I thought I might do is just speed us up a little bit because I know a lot of people have lots of traveling questions and some of the specific things. But just bringing us up into kind of the modern period of time in both Spain and Portugal is the world changes in Europe when, of course, democracy breaks out. And one of the deals is at the end of World War II, and this is a super long conversation, the end of World War II, Europe was essentially destroyed. These two countries kind of weren't. I mean, Spain was rebuilding from its own civil war, 36 to 39, but they just kind of sit there isolated. But France has to rebuild. Germany is, of course, absolutely decimated. London was bombed to smithereens. But up around, so not on this map here, you all know where Luxembourg is, a little Luxembourg. So, in fact, if you have connections to the Second World War, most Americans know about the Battle of the Bulge. You know that. So, where that is a town called Bastogne, which is in Belgium. Have you been, by the way? Really worth going. I don't know if I told you this, those of you I know, 2 years ago, my son did an exchange there for a few months. I just, now we speak French, so, you know, but, to Belgium, to Bastogne. But that little corner of Europe, where Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, historically, that's all coal mining. Ladies asked me a great question, got me thinking about coal mining. So that coal mining, they needed the power to rebuild Europe. So, but when you're going, because in one day from Bastogne, you can drive to 4 countries. And I did it on principle once, just to say I could do it. We drove down to Luxembourg, across to Germany, back to Belgium, and up to the Netherlands, right? It's all right there, so master. So because they had all this coal mining under there, and they needed that energy to rebuild Europe, in 1953, they said it's ridiculous that we're all being stopped at these different borders, so they create a free trade deal. A bit like Ontario and Michigan create the Auto Trade Pact, same thing about steel, right? But that's the origin of the European Union. That's what leads to this economic, again, that's another talk for another day. But they start to, as they expand out of that European coal deal, and they create this group of countries, they bring in the rules that I think we all totally agree with. You have to be a democracy, you have to have human rights. Well, suddenly these two countries get rid of their dictatorships, bring in democracy, and then they apply to the European Union, right? And so that's where you can really draw a line around the 1980, let's say. They have a few years to recover from these dictatorships to set up democratic institutions, and you draw a line there, and you can just about see economic development, so much so that by 1992, Barcelona hosts the Summer Olympics, if you remember that, right? Pretty neat Olympics too. I remember when they lit the torch, they did it with an arrow, I think, and they missed apparently, but they had someone behind to light it. That's a pretty hard thing to do. So that's where you start to see the modern development. Now, Portugal, like I was saying earlier, still remains one of the poorest countries in Europe. And what I mean by that is you don't see mass poverty, it's just wages are low. Good social services, everyone has public health care and all that kind of thing. Very high level of education, but I meet Portuguese, well, you guys, you're in Ireland last year, lots of Portuguese working in Ireland, and they'll say they're working really hard in the pub in Ireland in crappy weather, and they come from Portugal where you can surf and have nice weather, but it's like, I'm sick of earning 400 euros a month, right? And so that's why I've seen people move away. Spain has had, and if you look it up, Spain has the highest chronic unemployment in Europe. Now, pre-pandemic, their official unemployment always floated around 20%. That's a pretty significant amount of unemployment. It's always been a chronic issue in Spain. However, fewer Spaniards leaving Spain and more people from Latin America going to Spain. That said, after the 28 and 29 financial collapse, so obviously this country was hugely affected, particularly in Florida, where there's a lot of speculation on housing and boom. The same thing happened in Spain. All like Malaga, which is Marbella, these are the really fancy places down the coast where you see all the you know, nice apartments, like Fuengirola, you might as well be in Liverpool or Glasgow, like that's who's there. They're British people coming down, flying down, you know, 2 hours from Britain, and they have nice weather. And apartments all the way up to Valencia and nearly to Barcelona. And literally that 2008 financial collapse, all the cranes just stopped. So the economy was terrible. I mentioned this as a side note, 2013, 14, I was working in Peru in Cuzco, and my son went to school there, which was cool. Half the teachers were Spanish. They couldn't get jobs in Spain, so they went down to Peru, which of course wages historically are not great, but that was an option for them. So that was a little bit of what happened. But that European regional development money has just been incredible. And you go to all the four corners of Europe, historically, Ireland, Croatia, you know, the poorer countries, the infrastructure is fantastic. And one thing that will come as a surprise, but I noticed on the itinerary of your trip, is you've got a couple of train rides. Renfe, which is the national train in Spain, is actually faster than the TGV in France. But you probably read once upon a time that was the fastest, you know, the bullet trains in Japan. I think the fastest train in the world now is actually China. It goes down, I think it gets up to 500 kilometers an hour or 550. But the rain in Spain saves me on plane. But the trains in Spain are a lovely way to get around, because I'm actually booking a train just at the moment from Madrid to Seville, 2.5 hours. That's about 6 or 7 hours driving, and great, everything works. So the modern infrastructure is excellent. General costs are a little bit lower. And when I say that, you know, generally, Spain is considered maybe not that much cheaper, but just kind of a higher standard than other parts of Europe for kind of the same price. So, and Portugal is still pretty darn affordable. Now, Lisbon itself, the capital, is a fascinating city. Again, the language, if you don't speak Portuguese, you do hear English because Portuguese have moved away a lot, but the second language tends to be French. Historically, many Portuguese work up in France and Paris, although there is a massive Portuguese population, modern one in Toronto, huge, it's so many people have a Canadian connection, and in this country, where you meet the Portuguese historically, is around Rhode Island, that area through there, but they mostly come from Madeira and the islands, the Azores, the Portuguese islands, you know, but just huge connections. It's New Bedford, Rhode Island, or Massachusetts. Like you go there, and it's like everyone's Portuguese. This is an interesting little connection. Oh, and Provincetown, Cape Cod, right? That was Portuguese settlers and fishermen and everything. So they have Portuguese flags. You know, it's also that it has the most number of same-sex households of any community in the United States. So you have Portuguese flags and rainbow flags all over the town. They have a gay all the time. But so in terms of the modern countries, so I mean I can go on and on about Portugal, but the resort areas of Portugal, the south coast here, that is actually a huge number of Irish coming down there. Nice weather, although coastline, Portugal gets storms. And you can see why, because it's exposed to the North Atlantic, right? And it can be rainier. Northern Portugal is great for surfing, one of the best places in Europe for surfing. And this is the warmest area down here. Lisbon makes sense because it's a big natural harbor. The old historic part of Lisbon, you've got the castle. I mean, it's exactly what you imagine. So medieval castle. They've got these super cool trolley cars because the hills are so windy that they're really small. Like they're little, like maybe they hold 12 people, but it's just, you know, it's adapting to their thing. When you go up to the Royal Palace, expect to walk a lot in Lisbon. Very hilly and steps everywhere. And the other thing the Portuguese did forever is they put tiles in the ground. Now, it means they had a lot of enslaved labor. Putting tiles down all day long takes a lot of work. But you see it in Brazil and Rio and everything as well. Very distinct feature of specifically Portuguese architecture. But Lisbon's neat. Let's just stick there for a minute and then we'll go over to Spain. My reaction, and this is again, me personally, I've already had one person say they don't love seafood. My personal feeling about Portuguese food is about half of it is just not for me. Historically, the main thing that they would eat was salted cod, bacalhau, right? Or mojo, like bacalhau, and that's of course how you preserve it for coming across. If you had joined my talk the other day about the Canadian Maritimes, remember we were pretty sure Basque and Portuguese fishermen were already up in Newfoundland before John Caddick came. They knew about the Grand Banks and all the cod that were there. So that's a huge part. every time I'm in this part of the world, I will at least one time order the cod. And I'll regret it every time. But make sure you try it once, because that is one of their classic things, right? Portuguese though, still have a tapas culture, but not nearly as much as Spain. The tapas with the little plates, that's my absolute favorite way to eat, but of course, on my side of the world, we have such a huge Asian influence, we do a lot of Asian tapas as well. But that's how we cook at home. So when you come to my house for dinner, they'll have a plate of all sorts of fun little things. But in Portugal, make sure you get one of the breakfast, like pan au chocolat, the chocolate bread. In France, you get the nice croissant with a bit of chocolate. The Portuguese one, when you bite it, explodes chocolate all over you. You won't run out of calories there. Portuguese wine is, sometimes prices have gone up. But I remember sitting down for lunch one day and got a bottle of wine for €1. Like, the cork in the bottle happens, right? And make sure in Portugal you get a wine where you take the cork out, not a screw cap, because corks come from Portugal. Right? So you have all the cork trees up and down the coast, and they stay alive, but they go in and they pull corks out of the trees. And in around the base of them are pigs. And the pigs eat whatever grows down around there, and they have a real kind of black color to their meat. So as long as it's not an easy part of the world if you're kosher, because there's so much pork. But if you eat pork, there's you always have that as an option that's not seafood. Right? So again, experiment with it. Just know that sometimes, based on our palates, you'll probably find things really salty. I do anyway. Right? So again, about half my meals in Portugal are like, this is really, and the other half I'm like, we shouldn't know that. But and then eat your olives every day because you live forever. So, but again, historically, seafood, as you can imagine. But the inland, there's one major 4-lane or 6-lane highway that goes the length of the country, up and down. And then along the border with Spain, the border is actually pretty natural. That's all quite mountainous. Just like the border with France and Spain, like they're pretty natural borders, as opposed to be contrived. And so one side, boom, all Portuguese, the other side, but remember, there's no border now. It's the European Union. So you just zip along the country, you'll see a sign with a circle of stars, and we'll suddenly say España, or welcome to Spain. So I'll go on to Spain, and then we'll open up for some questions. But you head into Spain, many of you know so many of these names. Now, Spain is worth several trips, but the famous places, Seville, many people argue it's the most beautiful city. What month are you going?
It's mid-March.
Mid-March, perfect. Seville in the summertime can easily be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit every day. And that's why they all have a siesta, because it's so gosh darn hot. Now it's dry, so it's not a humid hot, but when you're getting up into that 100, 110, I'll be there in April this year, and it should be just lovely. It should be up in the 80s in the daytime. But that's particularly Seville, because the valley it's in is just cooking hot. Remember, that's also where the flamenco dancing comes from. Right, so that's a great place to do a flamenco show. But really neat, and the trees grow oranges all over the city, lovely and colorful. And then I have so many nice things about Spain. One of the things that can get a little tiring is every one of these cities has got some very important historic castle. When you go as a tourist, you need to bring your passport with you. Like, they must have had a terrible problem with people counterfeiting tickets or something, because they literally get your name and passport number against your passport to let you in, and a book time. Now the book times are important just because everything's busy in the world these days. It's same the world over now. But Seville is really lovely. Make sure you just have some time just to walk around in Seville. Now, lots of people go to Cordoba. Cordoba's interesting as well. That is one of the great big Moorish castles. So that's what's interesting there. And Granada, of course, the Alhambra. Again, that AL, then it's an Arabic word. Remember that Muslims cannot paint or depict God. I don't know if you know this. So that's why when they invaded places, they would scratch out the face on, say, Orthodox paintings. You see that in the center of Turkey and sort of things. Why I mention that, though, is they were the absolute best artists at just doing nice shapes and figures. Your classic kind of Moorish shape to a window or a roof. That's because they don't depict Mohammed or God. And so it's a different kind of art. The Alhambra is an interesting thing. Expect to walk for like 3 hours. And it's reasonably steep. Up behind Granada, interesting enough, Granada is not as attractive a city as a lot of the other ones, but everyone goes there because the island, right? And of course you're close to the coast. But up back, there's a mountain up here that's high enough that you drive up, they ski on it. So I mean, it's a lot of topography. I presume when you're driving along there, you're gonna stop in Rhonda as well. I just have to tease you with, everybody loves Rhonda because, help me Rhonda. But there's the famous bridge in Rhonda. That's Andalusia. So that's where you're up in the mountains, you get the whitewashed villages, but Rhonda's just just kind of a pretty special place. And oh, by the way, the Spanish just hate bulls. All they want to do is fight bulls all the time. Yeah, the bullfighting thing is interesting. So that's that kind of. So this is Andalusia down here. And again, if you're gonna go for a beach trip, then people stay along the coast, which is nice. Like I say, I wrote my thesis for my master's down there, but after a couple of months, that we didn't want to be there anymore. I mean, it's just another beach town. We could have been somewhere closer to home. Now we get up to Madrid. This isn't just me. Most people will tell you that Madrid is the best looking city in Spain. It's just the best city already. It's big. It's about 5 million. I mean, it's a major European capital. But the center is sparkling clean. It has a huge park, which is lovely, like as big as Hyde Park in London. The architecture is genuinely stunning. Plaza Mayor, the big central square. Of course, the Spanish are the ones who built all the great cities. And you can see that as you go south from here. I mean, really, these modern cities, I mean, Detroit, Chicago, I mean, they're all great. That's all that Spanish influence. Boston was built by the British, and everything's a circle. They don't have big horse-drawn carts, right? And that's why you get lost there all the time. But Madrid in the center is lovely. I really like Madrid. I like the people in Madrid. It's a city I always enjoy spending time. That's one of the real tapas centers. So you just go out and even if you sit down, nice outside cafe, then you just order something off the menu and you wait a while, you have another drink, you order something else. The real tapas tradition, though, the real tradition is you go out late, and this is the hard part because they eat late, right? But you go out and you go into a bar, and you see through window really where they can spoon something out to you. But you order a glass of wine, una copa de vino tinto, and Rioja. You know Rioja wines? Fabulous, great value Spanish wine, and the beer is everywhere and cheap and nice. But you order the drink, and they give you a tapas. They give you a plate to eat with it. The way you might get not seriously, but and so that's the tradition, and that's why if you're going out for tapas with friends, you go into a place, you have your little glass of wine, which you maybe don't even finish, but then you'll get some chorizo or maybe there's bocarones I had there. Then you go to the next place, and you have something in that one. That's how you do a tapas night. Lovely thing to do. And again, you can have great sandwiches, easy food, but again, just a lot of salt in the diet. I tend to be after about 10 days in Spain, I start to feel like I need something fresher, and it is quite an athletic population, and their food can be considered very healthy, the true Mediterranean diet. For years and years and years, the Spanish particularly felt that smoking was a cure for cancer. They've had less and less now, but it used to be breakfast. Like I'd watch people having kind of like a grilled cheese sandwich, a cigarette, and a beer, and it's like 7:30. But that is changing now. It is getting quite a lot healthier. But Madrid, Toledo, you don't need to stay in Toledo, I don't think, but as a day trip, it's very interesting. I just find in that part of the country the guides are generally excellent. Spanish, because of high unemployment, people train for a long time to get licenses. It's heavily licensed. So like I say, I run a lot of trips to Spain, but I always have to be working with a local guide when I'm there. And they get permits to go into the Prado Museum and all these sort of things, but they are excellent, but they use some language that I, as a historian on this side of the planet, struggle with sometimes. They're like, you see all our beautiful buildings, we got it from the Indians. Or when we civilized, they actually had an event in Lisbon last year. It was a papal visit, which is exciting for a lot of people, but they had these posters around of them waving to all the people they saved over in Brazil and stuff. Right? So it's interesting how that just can filter into the language a little bit. And you pretty quickly, like Toledo's traditionally not really supported Franco. So again, you might not notice it, it's just I know enough about it that I can hear the vibe in the language. But fascinating. But Madrid is just so lovely. Now I believe on your itinerary, and so some trips, we don't go to Barcelona at all, because it's a long way away, and the way to do it is to get on a train. Because to do that over the road is like a full day of driving, trains, a couple of hours. And make sure to always be looking out the window, because you'll see how dry that high plateau is, then it starts to get greener as you get towards Barcelona. So I'm gonna give you one negative about Barcelona, and then I'll tell you the good things. Barcelona has one of the highest rates of pickpockets in Europe. Right, La Rambla, which is the main street, lovely to walk up and down, but Barcelona just has, because it's such, I think part of the reason is because it's such a popular tourism destination. It's considered good value for money, people love Barcelona, but you just hear stories about being pickpocketed more there. Now, I was just there last year with a group, no one got robbed, but it's one place I enforce it more than I do in other places. So, now, obviously, when with purses, you want to be careful. My trick anywhere in the world is I just move my wallet in my front pocket, right? Simple little thing, I walk with my hand in my pocket, but just Barcelona specifically, you want to be a little more careful. It just has that reputation, and they know. I mean, everyone goes to see Sagrada Familia, the Gaudi church, the famous one that feels like a rainforest inside. But because it's such a massive thing, you have to stand back and do this. Well, that's a great place for something, right? That's true of Paris, it's true. It just happens more in Barcelona. So heads up about that. Barcelona is quite industrial, but the center part is interesting. You know Gaudi, like when I say the name, the famous architect. You go and see all the Gaudi stuff. You have a book time to go into Sagrada Familia. You'll see his buildings. You can tell me at the end whether you like his architecture or not. Interesting concepts. I mean, he was trying to, not use hard angles, 90-degree angles, flow. I don't think I want to live in a Gaudi building personally, but some people fall in love with it. But it's one of the big themes. So when you're in Barcelona, you get the Catalan history, you get the more modern, like the Olympics, and some interesting architecture that way, and then you get the Gaudi kind of houses. So that's sort of what one sees there. Now there are some interesting day trips out. Very close by is Montjuic, which is a monastery. I already used this joke, but I love this joke every time, because up into the Pyrenees, there's monasteries that go back to early Christianity, right back to the 3rd century, and they've been there, still with people in them, still with monks in them, up into the modern time. But I always wondered, because after 1700 years, all the monks are celibate, like their fathers before them. That's my joke. But yeah, that's an interesting transition. And again, well, this gentleman was actually in Madrid back in the 60s, and I remember, you really saw the presence. You saw nuns around, a lot less of that now. Modern Spain is, modern Spain does have a lot of political issues, because one of the most active separatist movements in Europe is Catalonia, right? The Basques, of course, for years, that was ETA, ETA. That was the Etruscan Liberation Army, right? And they did actually have, they did like the IRA. They put bombs off. Good news is no violence, and you feel safe in Spain. They have a lot of security, but it's nice and polite and easy. But that Catalan thing, so much so they actually had someone who tried to declare independence, and I think he's in Belgium now. He was going to be because they have regional governments the way you have state governments. So there's that political thing, and particularly in Barcelona, they have a strong movement that way. So Spain is, it's often in a little bit of political crisis. They've been vacillating between kind of two political movements. But the modern Spanish people, from a country that was so like that pre-1980, if we put that as a line, now Spain has had equal marriage for decades now. Like it's kind of in line with Western Europe, because you see the pretty similar value systems if you poll between the Spanish and the French and the, maybe not quite the Dutch, but you get the same kind of value system. You'll find a little bit more, actually you do hear more English now than you used to. Spain and Italy were always the countries in the past where you just didn't speak English. Because for years, the older generation under Franco, and then in Italy, for whatever reason, they just didn't learn other languages. More and more you hear it around now. But then, you know what? Most of you somewhere will have some words in Spanish. Portuguese is harder, unless you grew up with it. But Spanish is one of those big world languages, right? So it's probably the 3rd most spoken language in the world. All right, so the most spoken language in the world is Chinese, yeah. But in terms of global reach is English, and then Spanish. Yeah, and then Portuguese, or I would have to play with that one, but so Spanish is, because you've had it around a lot, you can read it, but pretty interesting. You know what, I can go on forever, why don't we open it up to some questions, because we've covered a huge amount of territory, but yes.
So you mentioned tapas a couple of times. What is a typical tapas?
It's a great question. So those 2 plates I showed at the beginning are 3, so some bread with a tomato on it, or just some olives, or the little boquerones, the anchovies and white vinegar, different types of sausages. Typically, sometimes you'll get a tapas menu. Really good news is often in the touristy areas, the menus have pictures. And just, say €4, which is $4.40 for a nice little tapas plate. Order 4 of them even if you're not gonna like one. Like, it's so much fun to try them. And then you find something that you'll absolutely love. Yes, Darcy.
Well, I have to ask, have you ever been to Porto?
Yes.
Okay, for comparison, to me, Porto was a lot steeper and harder to walk than Lisbon. Is that comparable to the rest of the trip to Spain?
Porto would be the hardest.
Okay.
Yeah, great
If
question.
you do that, I can do this trip.
Yes, yeah, Porto, so, no, I'm glad you're doing that, so for those who don't know, Porto is the Douro River comes right down the middle, and the city's this granite city that sits like either side of this huge bridges up top. So any part of the historic district is super hard. Yeah, you will find in Lisbon specifically, if you've been to Lisbon though, then that's just fine. The rest of it, the other places are pretty easy. The Alhambra Granada is it's just long, 3 hours, the guides are excellent, it's just to what extent you're really fascinated by Moorish gardens, and that's for you to decide personally. But yeah, no, I think Porto's probably the toughest of them. It's a good question. Yes, sir.
You mentioned like smoking, like on the train ride, are the cars no smoking or?
Yeah, I think they're all no smoking now. Yeah, and in fact, I think Spain and Portugal are all no smoking now. I'm just trying to. Sometimes they'll have sort of an outside terrace area that's a bit covered. I think both in Spain and France they'll still allow smoking in there. So I find it's actually nicer to go inside. I'm probably the same as you. I just find tobacco, it's so much an alcohol in our lives now. And do you remember when it was? Yes. I mean, I remember back when I was still living in Europe back when you go into a pub in Ireland, you try and find your friends. Just imagine what we did to our lungs back then, right? So yes, I can't be around, but then I get to states of cannabis, so there you go, right? We finally got rid of tobacco now. But yeah, generally you'll find things clean that way. Just generally clean altogether. And once again, generally service and everything, I think partly because they've had such high unemployment, people are very good at service jobs, because that was the main economy for a long time. So that's kind of nice. And this is just that basic intuition of travel. Okay, so let's say you don't speak any Portuguese, but a fellow comes up to you with a white apron, a pen and a piece of paper. What do you think he's asking you? And you can come up with dos cafés, por favor. 2 coffees, please, right?
Dos cervezas.
Dos cervezas, yes. And remember in Spain with the accent, they have that the, not in absolutely all of Spain, but that goes back to a king who was part of the Habsburg family, Charles they call him like Charles the Lunatic or something, because the Habsburgs are really good at inbreeding. You know some of this history, right? So much so that they all have these big long chins and everything, so artists would paint it off. Well, he was just so disabled he could barely talk, and so all the court around him, because he had such a heavy lift, they started saying, Teuta, y Barcelona, y cerveza. So my Spanish, which really comes from Chile, I don't speak like that at all. Incidentally, there's effectively no difference language-wise. Like, I understand 98% of what Spanish say. I struggle a little with Galicia, because their accent at the top there is kind of mixed with Portuguese a bit. I find I have to listen a little bit harder. But if you've learned some Spanish in Mexico or something, you're 100% fine. I mean, 100%. They have one other verb form in Spain that we don't in Latin America. They have a vosotros. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the usted and tú. So tú is familiar, right? And usted is formal. And then if I was referring to all of you, I would have said ustedes. It's third person. But if we were all close friends, in Spain I'd say vosotros. anyway, if you're into linguistics, it's quite interesting. We used to have a formal and informal English as well. So in French, vous and tu, in Spanish, usted, ustedes, right? Le, tu, in Italian and Portuguese. We used to have it, which was thou and you, but we actually dropped the informal, which is kind of an interesting thing. You guys, we're going to use.
I know you're not a weather forecaster, but in mid-March, what would the weather be like going from Lisbon to Madrid over Barcelona? What?
Lisbon is your only one you're taking a chance. Could be rainy, could be, but because Portugal just does get more rain because of this exposure. But temperature wise, like way warmer than here. Nice, moderate. I mean, it's Mediterranean kind of thing. So allow for some rain. And to your earlier question, I'll walk you through. If it does rain in those kind of places, all the tiles can be pretty slippery. So keep that in mind just from a pure safety point of view. But yeah, the weather in Lisbon, if it's not raining, lovely light coat. That's it. Seville, hot and sunny, gorgeous. Madrid, cooler in the evening because you're a bit higher up. Lovely in the afternoon. Barcelona starts to get rainy again up there. Alright, so it's this dry, so you can see where the dry is on the map, right? So dry Central Plateau. March is a great time to go. The last trip I ran was March. Yeah, just spending a great time to go. Really chilly. In fact, it was one of those peculiar systems where they had a lot of rain. So Andalusia was actually all green. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it wasn't a normal color. It tends to be browner. So because of the dry. But yeah, it's great. March, April. This is the kind of country you go in the shoulder season. I do some travel consulting for people, like I said, like I'm here, and some people did a trip last August. And I actually spent most of the time, it paid me a few $100s to do this with them. And I spent most of the first hour trying to talk them out of it. Like I think great one, but they were all school teachers, still working, right? So that was their period to travel. And I said, well, make sure your hotel has air conditioning in Seville, which it will, but just don't book anything mid-afternoon because it's going to be 110 degrees. And it was now dry, but so yeah, there's a reason why Spain's super popular in winter. It's I would say winter, December, January, February. Down here, Marbella is probably the best climate. Gibraltar's terrible, by the way. Gibraltar gets these windstorms that go around the big rock. But down along here, for my taste personally, to be a snowbird is a little cool. And January you're maybe getting into the 60s. Whereas if I'm gonna fly away from home, I want to get into the 80s. I go every January to Oaxaca in Mexico, up in the mountains. 85 in the day, 50 at night, and a blue sky. Right? So that personally I prefer that. You really have to get quite a lot further south. Remember, we're at St. Latitudes, Michigan. Right? It's just that it's a milder climate. So how about any other questions? Yes, sir.
In Madrid, I think it was in the mid-60s, I think it was along the Grand Via.
Mhm.
They used to have the bars and streets all had tables and chairs outside on the sidewalks. You could just walk down. Is that still the same?
It is. It's a great question. That's that real tapas bar culture. The Grand Via things are busier now than they would have been in the 60s, of course. They've all had a time machine. I'd love to go back and eating along there. But the places that are often they'll be in the main big squares as well. So Plaza Mayor, the big central plaza, little restaurants to sit, and big ones all out, and then the little side streets, tapas places. So you do see them sometimes. I find Barcelona a bit tougher. Barcelona's got great and affordable food and good tapas, but the streets are narrow in Barcelona, which might also factor into this pickpocket thing. And so the open window places where you just stand up at the bar to eat, it's delicious. But I often either hear cars or taste the exhaust a little bit. Again, I live in a national park. I just find pollution just such an effect on me. But so I like to get a street over to where it's pedestrianized. But back when you were there, the food would have been so.
And then they used to have big roundabouts.
Yeah, they still do, right?
And the cab drivers, I'll tell you, they were nuts.
Oh,
I get into a cab and I'd hit the floor because man, it was just.
so life is better that way now. I will say,
It was crazy.
my opinion of Western Europe, Spain probably has the most affordable cabs. And they're all metered, so they're not gonna be cheating you. Generally speaking, they're very obvious yellow cabs. And so taking a taxi is a really good option. Don't expect language, but you get Google Translate, or you show them the card at the hotel. that you can meet bad people anywhere. As a rule, they're gonna take you there. They're not gonna take you on a huge winding thing. But yeah, last time I was in Madrid, I was meeting someone, I didn't know where it was, so I got in a cab. And it was, it must have been good 20 minutes or so, and I think it was 10 euros. Like it was, so not nothing, but that same thing in London would have been 30 pounds. So to put it in some perspective. So yeah, but the roundabouts, the big fountains. Yeah, but they're not crazy drivers in Spain anymore. They did have that reputation, but the infrastructure now, that's the big change after the dictatorship. Huge modern highways, fabulous train stations. But any trip, and it's hard to do a trip in Spain without train rides, don't overpack, because you've got to get those suitcases onto the train, right? And like I pulled my shoulder with my last group because a couple of people came, they apologized to the Minnesota, and they said, "Dan, could you give us a packing course? We should do that, shall I do a packing course?"
We have
Oh,
one,
you have one, great.
5:30 tonight,
Oh, right.
right next door.
Yeah, because it's, pack the bare minimum and take out a third. I remember this one lady, like, two bags. And she said, well, I brought 2 winter coats. Like, even if you thought you need a winter coat, don't bring 2. So if you can have a nice size thing, because even though they do have luggage handling and everything, I always find it so much easier to grab your own bag. You wait an hour for a bellman to bring it up, right? They're always there to help and they're nice. And our service is really good that way. Hotels, as a rule, that mid-level hotel in Spain is a nice hotel, generally. And breakfast, try and be hungry because it's just a treat. And please experiment with the breakfast. Please don't go, yes, Devin.
Well, someone asked a few minutes ago about typical tapas, and I would like to put a plug in for patatas brava.
So we make those at home all the time too. So patatas bravas are huge, but basically like French fries. You cube up and just bake them. But then you can have an aioli, but really it's a spicy red sauce on top. So they're brave potatoes, patatas bravas. That is something we, like I said, we always cook, and something you put out because it's also a really good vegetarian option. Manchego cheese as well, very common, so really nice cheeses. They're drier, whiter cheeses, but so you can actually eat vegetarian or just take a break from the ham every day. So the Serrano ham is excellent. It's like prosciutto if you haven't tried it, but it's super salty. And if you're having that with a glass of red wine each day and you wake up, I have a headache. Salt wine every night, right? But yeah, patatas bravas is an excellent one. And you'll see that. So that's an interesting side comment as well when we talk about food. And in fact, tomorrow, I guess, the day after, I think I'm talking about Italy. Go back, remember, potatoes come from Peru, tomatoes come from the Americas, and pasta comes from China. The heck did they all eat 500 years ago? So, it is a huge change in diet. But that's, I really look forward to a trip to Spain from a culinary point of view. But by the time I leave, I've had enough salt. Right? A place I've never been to yet is Vigo, way up there. And very historic trading port. And I have a friend who has his own tour company up there and does culinary trips. So I'm going to try and go and visit him when I finish the tour I'm doing in April and just go eating all day. But that's a lot of things like octopus, that kind of seafood. Yeah. Do you like octopus? No?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, do you know, this is my very last comment. I try not, I like octopus a lot. But I watched a documentary about them and they feel pains and I'm struggling to eat octopus. Fish are gone. And I want to go out with someone from this beautiful state and go get walleye because I love walleye. I love it. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've hit time. Is there any last question or anything? You're all good? All right. So there's lots of other different trips. Tomorrow you have all the monthly meeting, and that's going to be fun. You have to come ready to do a quiz. Okay. All right, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow on the next day. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Ta-da. That worked well today.
It did.
Yeah. Oh, is it? Yeah. Here, you probably want to get rid of those pictures or something. Hey,
here's a scary thought for you,
Nice to see you again.
but, it being almost the season of Lent,
Mhm.
Culver's, the fast food place,
Yeah. Oh, yes, yeah.
has excellent walleye.
Does it?
They do,
Okay.
either plate or sandwich.
Because I had walleye last year out in the Thumb. We stopped at a
Yeah.
really neat little restaurant. It was kind of a house that was redone. It was, yeah, Gary knew it, but it was just delicious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I see, you mentioned that, and I said, any Culver's,
Well, that's good.
I'll take care of them.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You looking for a roommate? It's Thursday. The Italian,
Yeah, Thursday morning will be Iceland and Thursday afternoon will be Italy.
we're gonna try to make that. I don't know if we will.
Yeah, it'd be lovely to
But,
see you again. But
I love seeing you.
I love
And,
seeing you too.
enjoyed
Here,
your
I'm gonna
talk.
come give your daughter a hug here.
Yeah.
Lovely to see you.
I
Lovely to
think
see
we're in Spain, so.
you. Oh, it's.
Yeah.
What do you think about that headset? For some reason, I think I'm pushing my chin forward a bit and it makes my nice little.
Oh, when you're
stomach
talking on
release
that?
something, yeah. So easy to do those simple little things. Got it.
There it is.